If I was paid for every time I spotted suspicious observers stating falsehoods and claiming them as truths, I'd be a very rich man. Here's an example.
Meanwhile, the magnetic powerhouse of the IMF is strongly interacting with Earth via those coronal holes, likely began a bit over 24 hours ago and continues today as the openings take over the disk.
These are not coronal holes. This is a coronal hole up here. But this area down here, this is not a coronal hole. There is no coronal hole here until you get down into this region. Here's the latest synoptic map by actual space weather forecasters at the Space Weather Prediction Center. The areas where they identify coronal holes is here, an extension of the northern coronal hole here, and an extension of the southern coronal hole here. The area in this area does not have coronal holes. This area here does not have a coronal hole. His statement is false because he doesn't know how to identify what a coronal hole is.
Coronal holes likely began a bit over 24 hours ago and continues today as the openings take over the disk.
They're taking over the disk? Really? This is taking over the disk. I can tell you a year ago it looked way worse than this. This is not taking over the disk. This is not significant. This is a quiet solar disk. And this is a quiet solar disk. There are no coronal hole streams of any significant size that are going to be emanating from this region. Now I take issue with one other falsehood that suspicious observers states. Let's replay it.
Meanwhile, the magnetic powerhouse of the IMF is strongly interacting with Earth via those coronal holes, likely began a bit over 24 hours ago and continues today as...
Does it really? Let's fact check him. This is a plot of solar wind information over the last 3 days. He said within the last 24 hours, the IMF has strongly interacted with the Earth. He's using this information most likely, undoubtedly, to be able to claim some responsibility for the large earthquakes that have happened recently. Well, he can't do that because nothing has happened. What you see here is a plot of the interplanetary magnetic field. The black line is the total strength of the interplanetary magnetic field. The red line is the component of the total magnetic field strength that is directed north-south, that is, northward or southward. If the red line goes above the 0 mark, it is northward in direction. If it creeps below the 0 line, it is southward in direction. A quiet solar wind, a quiet interplanetary magnetic field, is one where the IMF field strength is below 10 nanoteslas here. For the last 3 days it's been below 10 nanoteslas. The IMF has not been strongly interacting with the Earth at all. If it were true, you would see major geomagnetic storms. There have been no major geomagnetic storms, not even minor geomagnetic storms, barely even any activity at all. I mean, look, here's the last several days. Geomagnetic activity has not peaked higher than a KP index of 3. A 5 is considered a minor storm. A 6 is considered a major storm. A 4 is considered active, and anything below that is unsettled to quiet. Anything below a 2 is quiet. Well, look. Here we have a K index of 0. A 1, a 1, a 1. These come every 3 hours. So this is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 24 hours. Here's the last 24 hours. It's been quiet. There has been no strong interaction whatsoever.
Meanwhile, the magnetic powerhouse of the IMF is strongly interacting with Earth via those coronal holes.
It is not. That is false. He's misleading every one of his subscribers, totally misleading them.
Likely began a bit over 24 hours ago and continues today as...
And that's not true either. So again, here's another example of a guy who has a lot of subscribers and he's misleading every one of them. If I go back through his videos, I can point out either in his analyses, like he's done here, which is incorrect, or I can point out in the news that he tries to provide, which is not interpreted correctly in many cases. Should I go through his past videos and demonstrate this? Maybe I should. Take the things that you hear with a good grain of salt, because a lot of the things that you hear from these people who are pretending to be experts but really aren't, are not being interpreted properly. Just because people have tons of subscribers doesn't mean that they're legitimate. It just means that they're really good at presenting information that can be tricky to interpret. Space weather is a complicated subject. It's very complex. There's not a whole lot of people around the world who can actually teach it, let alone understand it well enough to predict it or interpret it. Suspicious observers is one to be careful of. His information is often inaccurate, often completely false as it was today, and oftentimes can't be interpreted the way that he's interpreted things. Oh, and by the way, this is a picture of the sun in X-rays, and this is what a quiet sun around solar minimum looks like in X-rays. Very little activity. Very little.